Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Some connections have recently surfaced between Justice Nicol, who is the judge who presided over Johnny's case in the UK, and the defendants, NGN. And I've been asked to talk about whether any of these connections, based on the laws of the UK, can be seen to impact Justice Nicol's impartiality and his ability to render an unbiased judgment. Before we get into the law and applying it to the facts, we will set out the facts first. The first connection, which I find to be the most alarming, is that of his son. And yes, I do realize that his last name differs from that of his father, but he does share the same last name that his mother has, Camilla Palmer, who is Justice Nicol's wife. Robert Palmer works at Talk Radio, which, as you can tell, is a UK-based radio. Upon further investigation by users on Twitter, it turns out that Dan Wooten, one of the named defendants that Johnny was suing, also works at Talk Radio. To make things all the more suspicious, it turns out that Talk Radio is owned by Wireless Group Limited, which is a subsidiary of News UK and Ireland Limited, which is a subsidiary of News Corp, which, you guessed it, owns the Sun newspaper in the UK. So essentially, Justice Nicol's son works for the defendants. The next connection I want to talk about is in relation to Kathy Lett and Jennifer Robinson, Jennifer being one of Amber's lawyers, and Justice Nicol's wife, Camilla Palmer. As I mentioned in my last video about the judgment, there was a dinner party of sorts that was thrown in Amber's honor during the trial proceedings. The woman who hosted the party is Kathy Lett, who is the ex-wife of Jeffrey Robertson, a barrister who previously worked with Justice Nicol back when he was a barrister, and they also co-authored a book together. Kathy Lett is also a friend of Justice Nicol's wife, Camilla Palmer. I want to point out that there is no evidence that Camilla Palmer attended that specific dinner party. If she did, that would have been a huge problem and a definite grounds for arguing that Justice Nicol was clearly in bed with the defendants. Hey everyone, it's my vocal cords again. A helicopter was flying overhead when I filmed this portion of the video, and I ignored it as I was filming, thinking my microphone wouldn't pick it up, but it did. So you live and you learn. Anyways, I also wanted to point out that Kathy Lett is incredibly close to Amber's lawyer, Jennifer Robinson. And also in attendance was Baroness Helena Kennedy, who is also a barrister at Doughty, which means she also works with Jeffrey Robertson, Justice Nicol's co-author and ex-colleague. Baroness Kennedy is actually quite a champion for reform in the area of female victims of domestic violence. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with that. No one is negating the fact that women are victims of domestic violence. But the issue here is that these women seem to have supported Amber for years, from UN functions to this dinner, for example. So the issue that people are having here is there seems to be a very pro-female agenda going on here, in the sense that women are victims and never abusers, which is the entire issue surrounding this case. And so all these connections being so close to Justice Nicol have been a cause of alarm for many people. And then finally, there's the fact that Justice Nicol, back in his barrister days, was a barrister for The Times, which is also owned by Rupert Murdoch. And he scored a landmark victory for the freedom of the press in the Court of Appeal. So I forgot to talk about this particular point when I was filming, which is why we're back here with my vocal cords. I found a case which is a real-life illustration involving Justice Nicol as a way of showcasing that just because Justice Nicol was a barrister who championed free speech back in the day, that doesn't automatically mean that he is biased and is always in favor of free speech. Now, it's very important for me to say that I am not defending him. You all know my opinions about the judge based on my analysis of his judgment. If you haven't watched that video, please do. I am not in support of Justice Nicol, but I do like to be fair and illustrate that he did take a stance against freedom of speech at one point in the past. And ironically, The Sun was not happy with his decision and wrote an entire article essentially bashing him. I raise this also to illustrate that this could be an element of why he may have chosen to rule against Johnny and to side with the son in this instance. He may have received a lot more backlash than we even know about behind the scenes. So this may have been his attempt at saving his own career and accordingly deciding never to side against the press ever again. This is, again, speculation. We are not in Justice Nicol's head, so we don't know whether this previous case has had any effect on his reasoning and his decision in Johnny's case. But it is worth mentioning, if only as an illustration, that he has not always been a champion of free speech, at least in his capacity as a judge. All right, now that we've laid down the facts, let's get straight into the law. The first port of call is the common law test for impartiality in the UK. The established test is as follows. If a fair-minded and informed observer, having considered all of the facts, would conclude that there was a real possibility that the judge was biased, then the judge was biased and should have recused himself. So as an outsider looking into the case, who is fair-minded and well-informed, if they find, after considering all the facts, that the judge was clearly biased and should have recused himself, then the test has essentially been satisfied and the judge is deemed biased. The purpose of impartiality is to maintain the public's confidence and trust in the judicial system. Because as you can imagine, if judges were perceived to be biased and lacked impartiality, then how can we trust that their decision was the right and fair decision? The bar, however, seems to be quite high for justifying a recusal. An application for judicial recusal will be exceptional and will require the applicant to demonstrate the existence of exceptional circumstances. All right, so bearing this common law test in mind, let's have a look at the guidelines that have been issued by the judiciary in the UK, and I have referred to these very briefly in my last video about the judgment, to ascertain whether any of the listed situations that justify a recusal could potentially be applied to Justice Nicol. Now, do bear in mind, these are only guidelines. They are not hard and fast rules, which means that even if they don't exactly apply to Justice Nicol's situation, that doesn't mean that he wasn't biased and was not impartial. The benefit of these being mere guidelines means that the possibilities for a finding of bias are endless. So as I did in my last video, I'm going to display the guidelines. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them. I will point out the ones that I think either apply to our situation or are quite close to our situation. The first guideline I want to focus on is actually the second one. Friendship with or personal animosity towards a party is also a compelling reason for disqualification. However, note that friendship may be distinguished from acquaintanceship, which may or may not be a sufficient reason for disqualification, depending on the nature and extent of such acquaintanceship. This one applies directly to Camilla Palmer's connections to Kathy Lett, who was great friends with Amber's side. We have to focus on Justice Nicol here, not necessarily his wife, because it is important to point out that just because Camilla Palmer may be friendly with Kathy Lett, that doesn't automatically mean that Justice Nicol is also friendly with Kathy Lett and is sympathetic to her views. I'm not saying that that's not the case. I'm just trying to be fair here. So this one is up for debate. It all depends on the connection between Justice Nicol and Kathy Lett or Justice Nicol and Jennifer Robinson. If it is a friendship, it seems to be that the scale is balanced in favor of bias. But if it's a mere acquaintanceship, there's room for argument, as you can tell from the wording in the guidelines, depending on the nature and extent. So I'm going to leave this to you in the comment section, because the common law test is based on the fair-minded and informed observer. So what better way to find out whether this test has been satisfied than to ask the public to weigh in? I also want to comment on the fact that people in the legal sector are often very familiar with one another, have worked either against each other, with each other, so that in itself is not grounds for arguing bias or impartiality. And this is reflected in guideline number 4, which states that friendship or past professional association with counsel or solicitor acting for a party is not generally to be regarded as a sufficient reason for disqualification. So this applies to Justice Nicol's association with Jeffrey Robertson, writing a book with him, the fact that Jennifer Robertson is also quite familiar with Jeffrey Robertson. I believe he was her mentor at some point, or still is, I'm not sure. But this in and of itself doesn't seem to be a strong basis for disqualification and a strong indicator of bias, although again, there is always room for argument because these are mere guidelines. I also want to point out that Jennifer Robinson was Amber's personal lawyer on this case, and Amber was not the defendant. She was merely a witness. So Jennifer Robinson did not appear for the defendants. I just wanted to clear that up as well. Now, with regard to Justice Nicol's representation of the Times back in 2006 in his capacity as a barrister, Guideline 6 states that past professional association with a party as a client need not of itself be a reason for disqualification, but the office holder, being the judge, must assess whether the particular circumstances could create an appearance of bias. Now, as we mentioned before, the Times is actually owned by News Corp, which owns the Sun. So effectively, Justice Nicol has sat in on a case where one of the parties were previously a client of his. But as you can see from the guidelines, this, again, in and of itself, is not necessarily a reason for disqualification, but Justice Nicol must have assessed whether this particular circumstance could create an appearance of bias. So it doesn't even have to be actual bias. Would the common law test of a fair-minded and informed observer be satisfied based on this fact? Again, I leave that answer up to you in the comment section. Personally, I do want to say that a lot of judges, if not all judges, were barristers at one point in their career. And I feel as though, especially with huge companies such as News Corp, the likelihood of never sitting in on a case in which News Corp is a client in the UK is quite low. Meaning that it would be difficult if every single judge had to recuse themselves every time such a huge corporation finds itself in court. It will severely limit the pool of judges available to sit in on cases. So I understand why it's not a hard and fast rule of you must recuse yourself if you worked with this client before. The whole point of being a judge, after all, is to be impartial. So they're trained to view things impartially and to remove themselves from the situation in order to render a fair judgment. Whether this is actually being applied in practice is obviously questionable because judges are human at the end of the day, as I keep saying, but that is the sole purpose of a judge, and so they're trained to do that. If this was the only connection, his previous career representing the Times, I would think it was a weak one. But when you see things as the greater picture, with the numerous connections that Justice Nicol apparently has to the defendants, I can see this as one of many reasons to justify a recusal. So very much like evidence, it's the strength of everything put together rather than looking at everything in isolation. To further supplement my research, I refer to the Supreme Court's Guide to Judicial Conduct as well. Now, Justice Nicol is a high court judge, but these guidelines that I found are identical to the ones that we have just discussed, except they have some further supplementary guidelines that I'd like to refer to. The specific guideline I want to refer to is 3.12, which states that a justice will not sit in a case in which he or she, or to his or her knowledge, a member of his or her family has any significant financial interest in the outcome of the case. And of course, a judge's children are included in this definition of family. It is up to the judge to take reasonable steps to inform themselves of these potential interests pertaining to their family members. This one could be pertinent, it could be stretched to apply to the fact that his son works for the defendants. And if the judge found for Johnny against his son's employer, his son would suffer financially by losing out on his job entirely. And because News Corp is such a huge monster of a corporation in the media world, his son may be barred from ever working in the industry ever again. That can be argued to be a financial interest in the outcome of the case. Now, I do have to point out that his son is only a contributor to talk radio, not an actual full-time rostered employee. But I did find out through Twitter from a lawyer based in the UK that the fact that he's listed as a contributor of talk radio along with other regulars on the show is enough to presume that he has a vested interest in the outcome. And also, the fact that he's a contributor doesn't mean that there's no contractual agreement between him and talk radio in which they exchanged services for remuneration. I hate this word so much. Remuneration. I'm fairly certain that Mr. Nicol's son doesn't contribute to talk radio for free. He gets paid for his services, which brings us back to the financial interest in the outcome of the case. All right, now we've already very briefly talked about what a judge should do if there is a risk of perceived or actual bias identified. And that is either disclosure to the parties involved or a self-initiated recusal. In terms of disclosure in this case, I don't know if these conflicts or if these potential areas have been detected by Justice Nicol and disclosed to the parties involved in the case, including, of course, Johnny's team. Seeing as this information and these connections have been unearthed in a week since the judgment, it's safe to say that they weren't secrets per se, and that Johnny's team most likely have done their due diligence and have researched into the background of the judge if they had enough time, because another question I got was whether parties can actually choose their judge. And the answer is no, it's a random selection. And sometimes it's done with very little notice. Having said that, this case has been going on since 2018. So that's why I'm presuming that Johnny's team had more than enough time to look into Justice Nicol if they found a reason to. I'm not saying that every single party will look into the background of the judge. So it's either they were unaware, which I find to be unlikely, or they were aware and decided that it wasn't enough to justify a recusal. I'm not aware of any objections that they have raised, and I'm sure that that would have been made public if they did object to Justice Nicol presiding over the case. So it will be safe to assume that no objections were made. I don't like to assume, and Justice Nicol loves to do that, but in this situation, I don't have anything to go by. Everyone wants to know what can be done about this. Say Justice Nicol was found to be biased. What are the repercussions to this finding? I also want to answer a very commonly asked question that I get. Can Johnny sue the judge for damages? No, you cannot sue any judge for a decision that they have rendered. All you can do is appeal. That is the only realistic course of action that Johnny has at this point, and that is the course of action that he has decided to take. For those of you who are not aware yet, Johnny has shared this letter on Instagram and has confirmed his decision to appeal. I also did some further research and found out that the UK has the propensity to cover up these allegations of corruption and to cast a blind eye, meaning that corrupt judges or biased judges, because a biased judge is not always corrupt. Corruption and bias are not equivalent. But in the same vein, it seems that these situations are rarely ever handled in any way other than an appeal. It also seems to be self-regulated in the sense that judges decide on whether a judge was actually impartial or not. So that's an issue in and of itself. Self-regulation is never a good thing because people tend to look out for their own. It's like when a police officer is corrupt or mishandled a case and you report them to the police, to their superiors and to headquarters. They usually like to cover it up and tell you that you're wrong and that the police officer did the best that they could, and they turn a blind eye because they look after their own. The purpose of this video is to lay everything out for you and to get your decisions or your opinions based on the common law test in the comments below. So if I didn't voice a lot of my own personal opinions, I did that on purpose. I don't really ever want that to be the purpose of my videos unless I feel very strongly about something such as the judgment. In this situation, it is a gray area simply by virtue of the fact that the guidelines are merely guidelines. So there's always room for argument. However, if I had to pick a position, to me, it's his son that really raises alarm bells in my head. The fact that he actively works for the defendants. That is a problem. When I found out about Justice Nicol's son, that's when I decided to make this video. I'm not a parent, but I have parents, and I know how much parents love their children and are very concerned about the future of their children. So to argue that the judge was biased purely because his son works for the defendants is a very fair argument. That's it for this video. I do hope you found it informative. Don't forget to let me know what you think in the comments below, especially for this video. It almost entirely depends on your opinions. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I'll catch you in a future video.